thank you for the kind introduction. I'm honored and very grateful to have been invited to speak here to you about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As you can imagine, it has to be near and dear to your heart. Now, I didn't always feel that way about course design, to be honest. If anybody would have told me a couple of decades ago that I would be spending years of my life working on this, I would have probably thought this utterly insane. So here is what happened for this to actually come about. Like so many other things in life, it started with money and a new job. The university had received a large grant to help folks redesign their genetic courses. So one of the first things that, of course, we did was to review the old courses. So we grabbed a bunch of really big binders with copies of genetic course syllabi and recognized fairly soon that, many of them showed little resemblance across different sections of the same course. Some of them had lots of information in them, and others were just 1 or 2 pages long. That didn't strike me as particularly fair to the students, and it didn't strike me as particularly useful for the integrity of the program either. So that really is what got me started on looking for a different structure of designing courses. And 10 years later, I published a book on Ideabased learning, and that's really the 2-minute version of the story. So let me get started. And when I say let me get started, I actually would like to get you started. I would like to take a quick little survey of what you are doing with regards to course design and have been doing with regard to course design in the last few years and maybe in the near future. So here are a few questions that, just by a show of hands, I'd like to get some sense of where you stand. How many of you will work on a new course, new to you, of course, for the next spring, the summer, or fall? Show of hands. How many of you will do this? Okay, so that's probably about a third. How many have created a new course in the last 1 or 2 years? That's almost all of you. Excellent. Now, a little more detail here. What do you consider most difficult for you to do when it comes to course design? Designing learning outcomes, selecting course content, creating assignments, developing tests and quizzes. Who would say A? Designing learning outcomes is the most difficult. Okay. How about selecting course content, including the reviews? Then creating assignments. And developing tests and quizzes. So what we see here is not that surprising, especially when it comes to the first 2 questions that I asked you to respond to. Most professors are constantly working on new courses and course design. So that really is your bread and butter of your discipline. Right? If you aren't preparing something for a new course in the very near future, you have just done it for a previous semester. When it comes to what's most difficult, maybe you want to do me a favor by starting with learning outcomes. You knew learning outcomes was going to happen when I was talking about course design. So the larger group of folks basically said, yeah, that's probably and the others kind of were a little less important, and development test synthesis probably came last. Right. Here is my outline. And there are like 3 major blocks that I would like to go through. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about the reasons for idea-based course design. Then comes the bulk of it, because we're going to be talking about the boring stuff of different types of course design elements. We need to go through this, there's no way around it, but I will give you some opportunities to actually do some practice on some of these. So we'll be talking about big ideas and enduring understandings, areas of critical thinking, and authentic performance tasks and leading competencies for these. And then, of course, there will be some conclusions. Content versus idea-based course design is one of the themes that will run through this whole presentation. So by contrast to what is the opposite of idea-based learning? Well, that's content-based. And then I will also talk a little bit about course versus curriculum development. I will not talk about curriculum development as such, but I will say, how does, in short, course design contribute to a meaningful curriculum development? And I hope once we get to that point, you will agree with me. As I said, it will be a step-by-step procedure, and we will sort of about every 20 minutes or so, we'll take a break out, and you will listen. What's the problem with curriculum development? So let's start with the reasons for idea-based course design, and that has something to do with the curriculum. There are 3 different perspectives that you can look at here: the students, the faculty, and the larger community. So the student perspective may be something along the lines of, how do these courses fit together, in particular at the gen ed level? All these courses that I'm supposed to be taking, much of this stuff I've already had in high school, I think. By the way, I am intending to become a lawyer. How does all this contribute to me becoming a lawyer? The faculty perspective is not actually terribly different, maybe. The faculty perspective is, how does my course relate to the other courses? My course probably has some prerequisites. Certainly there are students in my class who are taking at the same time other courses in my discipline. So how is this all connected? And then we talk about society's perspective. Well, the community at large, I guess, has not looked very kindly at higher education in recent years, because people say, well, you know, college, first of all, it's getting more expensive all the time, and secondly, we don't really always understand fully what our kids are getting from it. What are the outcomes of getting a college education? What kinds of things can students do now that they have gone through 4, 5, 6 years in college? So we need answers to these questions. Desperately, we need answers to these questions. And I hope that at the end of my presentation that I can give you some of these answers. excuse me for holding on to my water bottle. I've been under the weather lately, so I need a lot of liquids. Here is something interesting from the website. There are lots of these things out there. That talks about the information explosion, for which many people are responsible. So maybe a century ago, people would say, well, the information that humankind has generated doubles every century. Then it was every half century, etc. Now we are closer to this, and probably this has already been superseded by now. Printed knowledge doubles every 8 years. Medical knowledge every 7 years, scientific information every 5 years, technical knowledge every 3 years. The sum total of human knowledge doubles every 2 to 3 years, and is soon to be expected to double every year. Useful genetic information doubles 18 to 24 months. Now, this is from a website that's called the Countdown. It explores Bible prophecies about the last days, which presage the end of the world as we know it. Apparently, the information explosion is a sign of the world's end. So, please, professors, slow down with all of this research that you are doing. Try to live a few more years. Moving right along with the information explosion, scientific progress, which is, of course, the engine of information explosion. Here are some questions that we need to have about scientific progress. First of all, how can the curriculum deal with all these bits of knowledge? There's way too much stuff out there now. And we all know that, especially sort of our textbooks, if we're using textbooks, are getting bigger and bigger every other year, if not every. Secondly, how can we help students synthesize information and synthesize information possibly across different disciplines? An easy task. And what's the essential structure of courses that can accomplish all of this? So, most knowledge, as I said, doubles every few years, and these are the kinds of questions that are the kinds of issues that we are dealing with. So, information explosion and expansion of content. Here are 3 concentric circles that illustrate what kinds of content we are talking about when we are dealing with college courses. First of all, maybe the largest area is the content that's worth being familiar with. Then there's a smaller circle of content, and that is the stuff that is important to know and to do. And then finally, there is the smallest area, and that is material that is crucial for conceptual understanding. We need to decide what to include and what not. Therefore, half of course design, half of the task of course design is to decide what not to include in your course. Not an easy task. Now here, this deals with how idea-based course design meets the challenge of handling content quality as well as students' skill development. Characteristics of idea-based course design, the way I propose it, focuses on a number of things. First of all, it focuses always on the big picture. It does not get lost in details. It make sure that it's manageable when it's dealt with the class. It anticipates students' learning barriers. This is when we're going to be talking about critical thinking in a few minutes. It anticipates where students are going to have difficulties, where they're going to go astray in the courses. Thirdly, it defines criteria for quality performance up front. Students should know right from the start of the semester, in the syllabus, and in what the professor is telling you. Students should know what to expect. Students should know what gets them a good grade, what makes this going to be a successful course for them. And then, of course, there is lots of practice required in the course. Competencies that are needed in order to do well on an assignment require students to get some practice on this. And it centers around authentic performance tasks. And for all intents and purposes, I guess at this point, we'll define these as real-life tasks. Here are the key components of a conceptual course design document. And I've clustered those into groups of three. There are the big ideas and brain understandings and learning outcomes. That's how we typically start with a course. And you have already, to some extent, admitted that that's probably one of the more promising things we will do. Then there are the learning barriers to critical thinking, which we will be talking about in some detail. And there are essential questions and guiding concepts that are related to this. And finally, we have performance tasks, or authentic performance tasks, that require performance criteria to be made clear to the students what it takes to do well on a performance task, and then, of course, what kinds of key competencies the students need to have. Those were the 9 that I actually have described in my book, but of course we don't have enough time to go through all of these today, so I've limited it to these 5 bold-faced ones. Here is a stylized flowchart of my course structure. Looks a little bit like robots from outer space, I guess. But that seems sort of the logical way to think about it, because I wanted this to flow nicely from top to bottom. So you have those 9 areas in there, and this is really important to look at. The whole scenario gives you a good overview. I just want to show it to you right at the beginning, and we'll review it. We will get back to it several times over the next hour. It's, when you look at it carefully, the main point there is the top 3 and the bottom 3 function almost like a funnel. It means you start off with the big ideas, the biggest elements, then you go to the somewhat narrower elements, in this case the learning understandings, and you end up with learning outcomes. That's the whole point of it, to make sure that it is easier to go from sort of a broad context, a broader context, which is already somewhat limited, to something that is narrower and narrower, and you have a good rationale for why you are doing this. Same thing actually happens when it comes to performance tasks, and the criteria for these performance tasks and the competencies that criteria are required. let's get started with the big ideas. Why start here? They position the learning outcomes within the larger curriculum, and I think that's the most important thing to recognize. Big ideas are not just sort of picked from trees. They are really the most important elements of the discipline, and you better choose very carefully which ones you want to address in your course. So they position what ultimately will be the learning outcomes that students are working towards within the larger curriculum. They thereby facilitate interdisciplinary teaching, right? Because big ideas are not just big ideas for maybe your course, they could also pop up in other courses. And so there are links. They provide more context for learning outcomes, and they steer the course away from mere knowledge. The distinction that I'm making, and lots of people have made between Ideabased course design and content-based course design, that really comes into play. We want to get away from having to struggle with too much content that is somewhat accidental for our course. Here are some examples, and you have more examples really in Exhibit 1 of what some big ideas are in different disciplines. In biology, we have the theory of evolution, and everybody recognizes that that would be, of course, a very big idea. In biology, we have things like cell communication networks. We have something like life, that is bigger in biology than life itself. And we have interdependent ecosystems. Those are just a few examples. In psychology, and I've kind of selected more from the social side, which is sort of my area. There are motivators of behavior, really important. Individual differences, psychological theorizing, if you want. We theorize in psychology as opposed to hard sciences or other areas. And happiness. That's the title of the course that I'll be talking about later on. Statistics, a whole bunch of very common big ideas that everybody recognizes, correlation, sampling, predictions, and tendency. So all of these would make nice big ideas for courses that would be taught in a particular discipline. Now here are some nice definitions, I guess, and I've been remiss at mentioning, I should have said that earlier. When I'm talking about my course design schema, it's really not mine as such. I've literally borrowed from other folks that have worked in the field, and in particular from Grant Wiggins and Jeremy Tye. Their book, Understanding by Design. So most of the concepts, the big concepts that I mentioned, are really part of their book and their work. Unfortunately, Grant Wiggins just died, I think, within the last year. So they have always come up with really nice definitions that I like. What are big ideas? They are the glue that holds the field together. I particularly like the term conceptual. They are important meta-concepts and important theories in the discipline. They provide another nice term, conceptual lenses for whole knowledge domains, lenses through which you look at material. And they cut across several disciplines. Like, for instance, the scientific method is a big idea in all of the hard sciences. It is a big idea in psychology and a number of other areas. Moving on to enduring understandings, course design component number 2. again, you have more of these in Exhibit 2, which is what you will be working with then. They are the derivations from big ideas. The key elements of big ideas definitions, their applications or their indications. They are the generalizations central to a discipline, and they are what hopefully students will understand and will remember past the end of a course, way past the end of the course. And I think we'll have sort of a proof of concept of this later on this afternoon, right? When your students are going to be talking about what they do. Again, some examples from different disciplines. Economics. I'll just give you one from each. Economics, specialization and division of labor can increase worker productivity. That may not sound like something really revolutionary, but if you think maybe 100 years back or so, division of labor changed the world really in the Industrial Revolution. That was a big deal. That was a big change in history, literally, not just in one discipline. Number 2, psychology. The one here at the bottom, motivation involves the interaction of emotion and cognition. Again, for no adult or psychologist, anything particularly splendid and unusual, but when I teach freshmen who are taking their first psych course, for them that's kind of a little funny at first, because, oh geez, motivation isn't that sort of warm and fuzzy stuff. In other words, isn't that emotion and nothing but emotion? Well, they kind of wondered, where does cognition come into play? So that's another area. And finally, when it comes to political science, different political systems vary in their tolerance and encouragement of innovation. Again, something that's rather important when you think about, in the end, autocratic political systems are really good for innovation in society. So there are some insights, some fundamental insights that are embedded in enduring understandings, many of which had been discovered many decades ago, but for the students, they may still be important and relatively new. Enduring understandings, why, the question really is, why are we reading all this stuff? Why do we have this derivation of coming from big ideas to enduring understandings to learning items? Well, I have already sort of given a little bit of a description of the rationale for why we're doing this, because it gives us a clearer understanding of what the context is from which learning outcomes are ultimately derived. But the other important reason for why we are using enduring understandings is we select those with your students' experiential and intellectual horizon in mind. Don't do that with the big ideas. The big ideas are very abstract areas that cut across not just different courses, but also all kinds of different levels of students. So once you get to that level of enduring understanding, you really are thinking about who are the students that I'm teaching in this course. And here again is this flow chart that indicates how this works. We start with really broad ideas. We derive a couple of, sometimes that's all it takes really. A couple of enduring understandings from each big idea, and maybe a couple, 2 or 3, and sometimes just one particular learning outcome from each of the enduring understandings. So remember, this provides the rationale for how you arrive at the Sometimes I have the feeling when I read syllabi that learning outcomes were somewhat picked at random. They sounded good, literally like picked fruit picked from a tree. You know, this here is a juicy one, and this here has a nice color, and this fits very nicely into my basket. That's not the best way of selecting big ideas. So here is the way this works. It provides a rationale for how you arrive ultimately at learning outcomes. And the other reason for why this is really important, I'll just remind you of that. Remember the slide when we talked about the 3 concentric circles. Half the task is to decide what not to include in the course. Terribly important. Right. We skip learning outcomes and get to your active engagement. So what I would like you to do at your table, now hopefully you have at least 1 or 2 people at your table who are from the same or similar discipline. Yes? No? Well, try to figure it out. I mean, it would be helpful to be able to talk to at least one other person who has a similar background so that it makes some sense as you discuss things. Identify 3 to 5 big ideas that are relevant for a course that you would select, preferably an introductory type of course, so that if we talk about it briefly afterwards, we don't just sort of go. We want to know, we want to understand in general terms how we write it. So, 3 to 5 big ideas relevant for this course, and then find maybe 1, maybe 2, so you try to bring understandings for each idea. And then be ready to describe the results and what you thought about the process. So I think we have some labor, and you are excellent. Thank you very much. Have some labor at your table, and you have exhibits 1 and 2 for you to look at. And let's go. The way this arrived, and keep in mind, it's not the end of the process. There's 2 steps of the process of ultimately coming up with learning outcomes. So, if we have any volunteers. Yes, and walking microphones here.
We talked about Discover Chicago classes and doing this process with them, and some of the big ideas that we talked about were diversity, reflection, integrating community knowledge with more academic knowledge, and those were the big ideas.
Any enduring understandings?
We got to a couple of those. I think one of those was an open mind. So if diversity is a big idea, then an enduring understanding would be employing an open mind in order to learn more about diversity. Did we have other enduring understandings? That was about as far as we got.
Well, that's a good step.
Mm-hmm. And the process seemed useful, I think.
Thank you.
Who else? Over here.
Hello. So we had a really rich discussion at this table about big ideas for a course that is meant to, I guess, complement a student's internship experience and help them articulate. So we came up with a list of 3 big ideas, but we did have kind of a little mini debate, or not a debate, but sort of an unpacking of terminology. And I think it was helpful, because the idea of, one of the big ideas is, having students develop a personal brand, one might say, or a personal story or a narrative. But there was a discussion about the terms. And in conversation, it came up that brand could be seen as maybe too tied to like consumerism or consumer economy or whatever. And so it was just it was a helpful back and forth though to have. And we kind of ran out of time and didn't get to the enduring understandings, but I think it was helpful just to sort of sort through the big ideas and have a discussion about even like the terms and the connotations
Sure.
associated with those. So
Thank you, that's helpful, and I want to kind of quickly make a comment here, because I've rushed through this, obviously, very much so. Some folks had some difficulties with, well, how do you distinguish between a big idea and an enduring understanding? Aren't they kind of same things? Well, first, one very simple distinction between those two would be big ideas are almost always expressed in one or two terms. Right? It's sort of a very abstract thing. So, whereas enduring understandings usually require like a whole phrase that make one aspect of a big idea clearer. Then one other thing that I heard that people had some difficulties with was, some disciplines focus on big ideas that don't sound like content so much, right? If you look at Exhibit 1, there are different types of ideas that I've mentioned there. There are the big ideas that are disciplinary related, that are discipline related, right? So you have big things which are very often big theories in any given discipline that you look at. But those are not the only big ideas that are out there. There are also big ideas in courses that are, let's say, skills ideas. You see that in the right-hand column, right? Theorizing, forming hypotheses, non-judgmental observation, right? Those would be enduring understandings, and they usually, those would be big ideas that are skills-based, that cut across all kinds of different disciplines. So that's important to keep in mind. It's not quite as simple as it sounds at first, because you really want to stay with the right category. Forgive me that I'm going to rush this through a little bit. You have several more opportunities to really talk in the coming hour or so, but I would like to stay on time, because Sarah has basically threatened me yesterday that towards the end of this session, she will be standing with big signs and say, "You got 5 minutes, get it done." No, wait a minute. Oh yeah. So let's move on to the next category, the next component of course design, and that's a really, really big one. It's barriers to critical thinking. Everybody talks about critical thinking. Employers in particular and other folks talk about the 4 C's that employers want in the graduates that colleges release to them. And the 4 C's are critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. So many employers would be terribly happy if the students that come to them, the graduates that come to them, would be good at any of those 4 C's. Right? What gets in the way of doing well generally in college is, well, there are some problems with critical thinking that students exhibit. And there are 4 different types. Now, I propose 4 different types. I have not seen anybody really do it that way, because typically each one of these types is considered sort of critical thinking in itself, where a whole book has been written a whole paradigm of critical thinking really has been utilized. So I'm talking about intellectual maturity. Those are shortcomings that are happening frequently. There are attitudes towards thinking, and yes, thinking generates attitudes, believe it or not. There is reasoning ability, and then there is sophisticated versus simplistic explanations. To represent this a little, or present this a little differently here, is there are these intellectual developments that students are going through, which is what I called in the previous slide, potential for intellectual maturity or immaturity. Habits of mind, those are the attitudes towards thinking. Complex reasoning, that's very often almost identified with critical thinking. It's logical reasoning ability. And then there are learned misconceptions. Now let me review each one of these in a separate slide so that it becomes a little clearer to you. When we're talking about intellectual development, there was research done already in the 1960s by William Perry. He put out a book in 1968, Intellectual and Ethical Development in the College Years. And then there are all kinds of more theoreticians, researchers who have looked at different stage models, different whatever models. Usually people kind of shy away from calling these stages, but for now, for simplicity reasons, I will call them stages. So when it comes to intellectual development, the early students, the students that you typically see in freshman classes, some, I don't want to exaggerate here, might be in a phase of, or in a stage of dualism. For them, knowledge is facts, right? Give me the facts, nothing but the facts. And facts are either right or wrong, they're good or bad, they're black and white. So it's just two options. Now at some point, students tend to recognize, well, geez, there are questions that can't always be clearly answered with one answer, with the right answer. There are questions that, basically yield an opinion. And so the pendulum swings from being, into objective facts to saying, well, pretty much everything is an opinion. And professor, if you give me a bad grade on an essay exam, on an essay that you asked me to write, I have to question you. My opinion, just as valid as your opinion, right? I've done everything else the way you wanted it. It's a 10-page paper, there are 10 pages. There are 12, the required 12 references to the page. They are neatly typed up, and there is even a staple on the upper left-hand corner, right? So why do I deserve a C-? Just because it's my opinion? So those are the kinds of behaviors that you might occasionally encounter in your classes, and they have something to do with students' intellectual development. So therefore it's crucial to get your students at least to phase or stage 3, the contextual relativism, where a good opinion or good opinions are always supported with reasons, right? So yes, lots of things cannot be clearly answered at this stage, but opinions need to be supported with reasons so that we can discuss this stuff. Move on to the next one. Habits of mind. This comes, in this particular case, from Richard Paul and Linda Elder's 2001 book, Critical Thinking. And they have talked about a lot more about habits of mind, but I particularly like that term. They talk about critical thinkers are fair-minded, as in fairness-minded. behind it, which includes intellectual humility, courage, empathy, integrity, perseverance, autonomy, and confidence in reason. So when you look at these, yes, you would expect that a critical thinker has some intellectual humility. That means he or she is aware of their own biases, at least tries to be aware of their own biases. Courage, intellectual courage, they face ideas that they actually kind of dislike. I don't agree with what your idea is here, right? So I think you're just wrong. No, it's a matter of let's get into a discourse about this. They have empathy. They put themselves into others' shoes. And then there is integrity, admitting to problems in their own thoughts. Well, there is an interesting concept, right? We are seeing some wonderful examples or non-examples of this in the current presidential elections, but I won't get into that. So, there you have habits of mind. How do you teach these habits of mind? Well, it's a matter of modeling behavior in particular, setting good examples. Complex reasoning. As I said, this is probably the most common way of looking at critical thinking. It's logical reasoning. It's coming up with sound arguments and stuff like that. Stephen Brookfield is one of the big proponents of looking at critical thinking in those terms in his 2012 book, Teaching for Critical Thinking. I think he has been here at your institution as well. So these are things like the ability to identify pertinent issues, to recognize stakeholders and contexts, to acknowledge that there are different perspectives from which one can approach a particular topic. There is the ever important hunting down assumptions that one needs to kind of engage in order to get at the real truth, if there is such a thing. Evaluating evidence and evaluating implications. This is basically the stuff that almost all critical thinking rubrics are made of. So those criteria you would probably find in just about any critical thinking rubric that is out there, right? One more word about rubrics. Rubrics are not just a tool for assessing students. Rubrics are a wonderful teaching tool, much more so, I think, than just an assessment tool, because they get students to probe their own thinking, to maybe even sort of figure out, well, this paper that I just wrote, does it hold mustard? Let me run this through a critical thinking rubric. So that's very useful. The next one is a little difficult. Well, all of them are a little difficult. This deals with learned misconceptions. Howard Gardner, in his 1991 book, The Unschooled Mind, How Children Think and How Schools Should Teach, gives any number of examples on this, but it's already a little old by now, so you need to hunt for more examples of this, probably on websites in particular. There are an awful lot of websites out there, in particular in the sciences, that have given examples of learned misconceptions. And they tend to be discipline specific. That's why I can't really go into too many details here, because they look differently in each discipline. For instance, many people, graduates from college even, they think that the seasons on Earth come from the different distance between Earth and the Sun. It's a very common misconception. Scientists always have to struggle with their students kind of figuring this out, but it's not true. But students have learned this from almost child on, or at least maybe elementary school on. There was sort of this conception of that's a logical thing, and all of these misconceptions tend to feel very logical in a way, right? There's a good reason for why people believe in them. Anyway, so that's a fourth category of barriers to critical thinking. All right. Here is yet another opportunity for you to talk with each other rather than just to listen to me. In your table groups, recall a few learning barriers to critical thinking. Now, it would be nice if you could even categorize them into these 3 or 4 that I've just given you, but that's not a requirement. You won't get a better grade if you do that. Which learning barriers have you encountered in your students, in your courses? I mean, if you have taught any course for multiple times, you will have seen and you will have been able almost to anticipate where students are going to have difficulties, where they're going to struggle, where they're going to come up with a wrong turn in the fork on the road. So please do that. Which learning barriers to critical thinking have you encountered? Can you maybe identify them as one of these and be ready to describe again the results that you have done in the past to work on these student problems? All right. Second major conclusion really looks at the connection between course and curriculum development. How does one facilitate the other, and maybe also vice versa, although I think I'm not quite there yet with the last one. Anyway, so the first point that I want to make is the importance of alignment. What's alignment? In this particular case, we're talking about the alignment between what you set out to do in your learning outcomes, what you then assign students to do in order to acquire these learning outcomes, and what eventually you were able to assess to what extent your students were actually doing well, or maybe not so well, on these learning outcomes. So these need to fit together, and I'm not going to go into the detail of exactly how these here fit together. You can see there's a big idea on the left-hand side for information literacy. Then there is a task that deals with developing research questions that is an information literacy task. And then there is a rubric, an information literacy rubric, that helps you determine needed information, accessing information, and evaluating information. So this would be sort of one example of how things are being aligned in your course. The next one is a somewhat longer list between the comparison between content-based and idea-based learning and course design. So the question is, And I'm not going to read all of these. I'm sure you can do this by yourself. But I'll give you maybe a few of them. Courses have certain characteristics. And here, certain characteristics of these courses would be, what is the course organized around? The content-based, the first one. The content-based course is organized around topics and facts. I told you, it's a little black and white. Not too many faculty teach just that way. But still, the content in the content in the content-based course is organized around topics and facts, whereas the content in the idea-based course is organized around big ideas, enduring understandings, essential questions, etc. Purpose of assessment, that's the third one from the top. The purpose of assessment in the content-based format tends to be, well, I need to assign grades to these students. So that is what the purpose is for giving exams, giving papers, etc. While in the idea-based course design, it's a matter of providing practice and feedback. Is making sure that students actually learn something and will walk away with skills that they can apply, not just walk away with a grade. The next one that I want to just say one little thing about. Oh, all right, thank you. Okay, let's use this. I could actually point it much more easily. Could have used it there, but here it's really just critical thinking, right? And in the content-based course design, critical thinking, well, I'm being a little cynical here, but I think it's very often just hoped for. If you're doing a lot of lecturing in a class, and you are hoping that your and you are assuming that your students are paying good attention, I'm sure if they were good students who can pay attention for 60 minutes or whatever it is at a time, they probably would learn some critical thinking skills. But quite frankly, how many students are, right, for 60 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes, whatever it is, right? So in some ways, in this approach to course design, we're just hoping that something is going to stick. Now, whereas in idea-based course design, it's very different. That course was directly designed to address certain misconceptions and certain barriers that students have. So you better bet that students will take something away about critical thinking in that course, unless it's really taught badly. Finally, the student role. The student role is one of pretty much passively receiving knowledge in the content-based course, whereas it's a matter of actively making sense and getting some conceptual understanding in the idea-based course. So if the course is driven by content versus ideas and conceptual understandings, conclusion, the course character is strikingly different. Strikingly different. Which of these two approaches do you think will help students learn better? I leave that up to you. Here are some more advantages of idea-based courses and course design. Number one, it provides focus for what to teach and what to leave out. And we've talked about that several times. Important to know what not to put into your course. Number 2, it emphasizes critical thinking by anticipating expected learning barriers. Number 3, it centers the course around authentic performance tasks to increase student understanding and motivation. And number 4, it identifies key competencies that need to be taught if students are to succeed in the course. And now for what I consider to be probably the most important advantages. The course design document of 9 interrelated components communicates a course blueprint in 1 to 2 pages, very succinctly. Thereby, it creates a document that also facilitates systematic curriculum development. And here is where we make the connection between course and curriculum development. The 9-item blueprint in the course design document, and this is sort of my main message to you for today. The 9-item blueprint in the course design document makes the course transparent so that it can more easily be integrated with the rest of the curriculum. And that should go a long way to addressing the 3 questions that I raised at the very beginning. The 3 different constituencies that we need to kind of keep in mind, namely the students, the faculty, and society at large. And this was the slides that went along with this. If you have a detailed but very succinct blueprint of each course in your program, you can answer these 3 questions, at least sort of in fairly general terms. How this Gen Ed course relates to other Gen Ed courses. You have blueprints of each one of them. You can take a look at how these fit together or how they don't fit together. If they were created sort of in isolation from each other, they probably won't fit together very well. But then you have evidence that there is more work to be done on the curriculum. You can answer the question of what are students learning in the prerequisite courses that lead to the course that you are teaching this semester, or in other courses that you are teaching this, that students are taking, and thank you, that students are taking simultaneously with your course, and you would like to know what happens in those. You know, does any of that relate to what I'm talking about? Are students getting bored? I see those bored faces looking at me, maybe because it's not I'm a bad teacher, they've already heard it twice in a previous course. And get this, it will answer the question of which sets of key skills students acquire in college. Because remember, you have actually carefully designed the authentic performance tasks with the kinds of skills that are needed to do well on these performance tasks. So you have the really important lists of competencies on your course design document that people can show to others and say, look, this is what we learned in these courses, if you want to boil it down to competencies. But there is more information on there than just that. And I think this is the best we can expect from systematic course design. It not only describes the individual course, but at the same time identifies all the possible connections, that means the possible connections with the rest of the curriculum. Thank you.